ratio was about 1 to 3 rather than 1 to 35. And so the only similarity between the two schools was that they both took place in buildings, and that they dealt with roughly the same age group, and the film reflects, I think, the difference in the nature of education that each offered.
You're best known as well, of course, you're an American filmmaker, and you've so many American institutions have been the subjects of your films, and for example, welfare, public housing, high school, mental institutions, and your latest films have been about institutions in France. Last 3, I believe.
No, well, Boxing Gym was, which was the one before Crazy Horse, was about a boxing gym in Austin, Texas. But it's true, in the last, I made Comédie Française in Paris in 1995, and then The Last Letter, which is a fiction film, in 2001, and then La Danse in 2007, and Crazy Horse last year. So that I've made, in the last 10 years, in the last 15 years, I've made 4 films in France. And as to your as yet unasked questions as to why I make films in France, I mean, basically, I like living in Paris. The food's still very good, and it's a beautiful city. But also, the subjects that I've done in France are subjects that I couldn't do in America, in the sense that America has no theatrical repertory company with the tradition, a 300-year-old tradition of the Comédie Française. Similarly, it has no dance company with a 300-year-old tradition of the Paris Opera Ballet. And while there is a Crazy Horse in Las Vegas, the home base of the Crazy Horse is in Paris.
Right. It's not quite the same tradition and foundation in Vegas than they have in Paris.
No, I don't think so. And generally speaking, what I'm trying to do is make films about as many different aspects of human experience as I can. And while I did make a film about the American Ballet Theater is very different than the Paris Opera Ballet, because in terms of duration, it's been around about 75 years. It doesn't have an endowment. I mean, the Paris Opera Ballet gets an enormous subsidy from the state, and always has. I mean, back to the time of Louis XIV. I think American Ballet Theater now has its own dance school, academy, to train dancers, but at the time I made the movie it didn't, whereas the school of the Paris Opera Ballet has existed for 150 years. So that there's a big difference in the nature of the companies.
Got it. You have done some fiction films as well, right?
Right.
And of course, the experience is incredibly different. One is, finding the story once you've done all the shooting, and one is you already know what the story is and to shoot for it. Or you can probably put it better, you being the filmmaker. But I was just kind of wondering, what's harder? What do you find more difficult?
I found it harder to do the feature film. Well, of course, I have had less experience at that. But it's also boring to shoot the same sequence over and over again. I mean, in the case of The Last Letter, I mean, I enjoyed making the film, but the contrast between that and making a documentary was enormous. Documentary, you always have to be on a ready alert. You never know what's going to happen next. Except for performance films, you never get a chance to shoot the same thing a second time. And you're running around all day carrying the equipment and, trying to figure out what's going on. It's a much... I found it much more stimulating than doing. I mean, I like The Last Letter and I like the way it came out, but the process was not as much fun as making a documentary.
I went to film school here in Columbia, studied film, and of course we watched Titicut Follies as, example, one of the first, maybe the first. Cinema verite, fly on the wall, direct cinema, whatever you want to call it.
I don't want to call it any of that, but
okay. But a documentary which didn't have narration, which didn't, it was just showing what happened. Can you talk a little bit about even though you don't narrate and say this is the mighty whatever, do you still believe that your films have some sort of bias and subjectivity
Well, I
within
think
the
they're
process?
totally subjective.
Yeah.
I don't see how they could be anything but, because they represent the final film is a result of thousands. I mean, I don't know, maybe hundreds of thousands, or certainly thousands of choices, and those are choices that are made by me. And I have no objective way of making the choices I make. The standard I use is the word that I mentioned before. I tried to make the films fair to my experience, but even the use of the word fair is a completely subjective word. I don't know that the films would be any more objective if each sequence was shot with 360 cameras from 360 angles. But so, in a sense, the final film is a report on what I think I have learned as a consequence of being at the place for 6 to 10 weeks, and then studying the material, because it typically takes me a year to edit the film.
Wow.
And I don't really know what the structure of the film is going to be till I'm well along in the editing. Initially I just edit sequences that I like, and it's only when I've edited all the sequences that I might use in the final film do I begin to work on the structure.
Speaking of these sequences, there are some absolutely beautiful sequences in here, which are just like kaleidoscopic art. The women's bodies, there's light being shown on them, all sorts of projections while they're dancing beautifully. Colors are mesmerizing. Can you tell me a little bit about the cinematography and, why you chose to include a lot of just beautiful artistic shots rather than, say, conversations between the art directors and stuff like that?
Well, the film is made up of both those kinds of sequences, but the Crazy Horse prides itself on the quality of the show, which includes the beauty of the women, the lights, the makeup, and the costumes. So I was able to. I was the beneficiary of that for the film, and I wanted the film to show. I thought some of the acts were quite beautiful, and the lighting was great, and I wanted the film, to go back to the earlier language, the film would not be fair to the Crazy Horse if I didn't show that. And at the same time, I had to. It wasn't a question of literally showing it, just sort of taking shots of the show. One, is a gross exaggeration, and another way of making the movie was just to do, put the camera in the back of the theater, do a wide shot, and you see the show. But I also, it had to be interpreted. I wasn't making an archival record of the show. I was trying to make a movie out of the show, so it had to be shot differently. And one of than what you see when you're at what you see with the eye when you're at the theater. And one of the advantages from filmmaking, from a documentary filmmaking point of view, of shooting performance is you can shoot it several times. As we said before, at the Crazy Horse there are 2 shows every night, and on the weekend 3 shows. So, for example, there's a number there called Baby Buns, quite funny, but we could shoot it any number of ways. One night it was shot as a wide shot, another night it was shot from the left side of the stage, another night from the right side of the stage, another night from just underneath, right at the edge of the stage, looking up at the dancers, so that when I got back to the editing room, 6 months later in the editing room, I could cut it like a dance number from a feature film, because I had, many different angles, and the dances were pretty much the same, and they look the same anyway when they're made up. So I could cut it like a dance number in a fiction film. Whereas when you're at the Crazy Horse, you don't see it that way, because the Crazy Horse, you're always looking basically at the wide shot because your eye doesn't have a zoom lens. But I could go to a close-up or a 3-shot or a 6-shot or whatever.